You're listening to episode 187 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Candace Gorham joins us to speak about her new book, The Ebony Exodus Project, Why Some Black Women Are Walking Out on Religion and Others Should Too. There's something I'm concerned about in our contemporary Western Sanghas, and that's a lack of diversity, particularly ethnic diversity. Why is that? Isn't the practice for everyone? So why aren't our practice communities representative of the full spectrum of our local communities? POCs, or persons of color retreats, are becoming more common, but general participation in our Sanghas still has a lot of ground to cover. And even more deeply, are our religious institutions really helping equally? Black women are the single most religious demographic in the United States, yet they are among the poorest, least educated, and least healthy groups in the nation. Drawing on her own past experience as an evangelical minister and her present work as a secular counselor and researcher, Candace Gorham's The Ebony Exodus Project makes a direct connection between the church and the plight of black women. Through interviews with African American women who have left the church, the author reveals the shame and suffering often caused by the church and the resulting happiness, freedom, and sense of purpose these women have felt upon walking away from it. This book calls on other black women to honestly reflect on their relationship with religion and challenges them to consider that perhaps the answer to their problems rests not inside a church, but in themselves. Candace Gorham's religious background is varied, including Jehovah's Witnesses and Methodist. Her time in non-denominational charismatic churches led her to involvement in casting out demons, fasting, and tongue-talking. Today an atheist, Candace started the Ebony Exodus Project out of her own pain and anguish as a highly religious black female who was not getting adequate support for her struggle with mental illness. Today she endeavors to help men and women, especially black women, address and recover from the oppression they faced while in the church. Candace has a bachelor's degree in secondary education and a master's degree in community counseling. She taught high school in the United States and middle school in Bermuda. She has worked as a counselor in group homes, intensive in-home programs, and day treatment. She has also served as a regional manager and eventually the training director in a mental health agency. She currently works as a compliance officer in a mental health agency and provides individual therapy and assessments. So sit back, relax, and have a nice oolong tea. And our guest today is Candace Gorham. Candace, thanks for being here.
Hi, thanks. I'm happy to be here.
So you have a fascinating background, I gotta say. There's just quite a culmination of facets to your life. Tell us about that background before we dive into the book.
Well, I guess, like you said, my background is, as far as, especially my religious background, I would say is really diverse. I grew up, my early years, we were a Jehovah's Witness. My mom wasn't really that into it. You know, she just sort of did it because that's what my dad was doing. But then when they separated, when I was in 3rd or 4th grade, I guess, We stopped going, but I was so into it that I continued to study. Actually, I was the only person in my family. My mom, I've got an older brother and sister. And of course, my mom and dad split, so my dad wasn't there. And I actually met some other Jehovah's Witnesses one time. I guess they were coming through our neighborhood, and I went, "Oh yeah, I want to study again." Now this is me, fourth grade, fifth grade, and I wanted to study with the Jehovah's Witnesses some more on my own. So as a child, like I always took it very, very seriously. So I continued to study, and I met with them weekly, and I would go to the special conventions with them. It was a family, and they basically sort of adopted me. They would come and pick me up and, check on me throughout the week to see if I need. I mean, it was just really, and that's one of the things about Jehovah's Witnesses is that they really have this sort of embracing, really create a sort of family vibe. We're really here for you. But then if you do something that they don't agree with, they're not quite so forgiving or loving, let me say. So from there, I got to middle school, and, middle school is middle school. So I became a little less interested in religion. I stopped going for a while. And then I actually ended up reconnecting with one of my dad's sisters. And I started going to what was like the family church, the church that my dad and all of his siblings grew up in going to. So I ended up going back to church with her, which was a Methodist church. And I went through confirmation. I was confirmed in the Methodist church, and, I was in the choir, and we did all of that stuff again. I was very, very, very serious about this, and I remember in the 8th grade trying to get one of my friends to come to church with me. And now the thing about this Methodist church is kind of funny, because this Methodist church had some very Pentecostal vibe to it. Like they used like anointing oil, and if they were praying and somebody fell out in the spirit, so to speak, that was normal. They were shouting and stuff, which is stuff you don't typically see in most Methodist churches. And it's funny because when some of the sort of sister churches in the area would come around, of course it was mostly white Methodist churches, and they would come and they would just be so blown away at how energetic, our congregation was. And so I remember being in the 8th grade and having some anointing oil that my aunt gave me. And I was like putting it on my friend, and I was like, you got to get saved, girl. And so this is me, 8th grade me, trying to minister to my friend who was like, I really need you to wipe this oil off of me. And which, we laughed and stuff. And so again, I did that for a couple of years with my aunt. Then got to high school and got a boyfriend, a serious boyfriend in the 10th grade. So by then things happened and I was no longer going to church. And when I was 18, my sister married a minister. And so I started going to church with him. And he was actually just starting up. Like he had previously had a church and then he had to close it down. And so he was actually just starting up sort of his second ministry. So, there weren't many of us at that beginning stage. And that was really where I started getting into the like shouting, laying on hands, anointing, speaking in tongues. We did all of that. And again, I was very serious about it. I would fast. I was the type of person I would fast. Sometimes I think I've gone maybe 3 to 4 days with no food, just water. And then I've gone, maybe 5, 6, 7 days, maybe about 7 days, about a week with like maybe just juice. Yeah, I mean, that was where it really got going for me at 18. And again, got to college, had a year or so where I wasn't going quite as much. It throughout the years, anytime that I was not in church and not going on a regular basis, I was like tormented with guilt and just worried all the time that I was going to die, and I was going to die in sin, and I was going to go to hell. But, also at the same time, college student, smoking, drinking, having sex, it was like I wasn't ready to give that up yet either. I mean, because like I said, see, when I was in high school and I was 18 and I started going to that church with my sister's husband's church, I was there for a little while, but then once I got to college my freshman year, obviously I was about an hour away from home. So for a while I tried to go back and forth, but of course, you know how that is, it slowly started tapering off.
That's quite a trip if you have an hour to get there and back.
Well, what's funny is that after I ended up getting married at 20, my husband and I met him in college. And I brought him into church. We were dating for a while, and I tried to break up with him because I was so convicted. I felt so guilty, and I tried to break up with him, and he didn't want to break up. And I was like, well, look, I don't want you to feel any kind of way. I don't want you to feel like any kind of pressure or anything. And so he came to church, and he got into it. Like, he really got into it. So then, I was surprised because he didn't really grow up with any kind of religion or anything. His parents taught him, God and be good and that sort of stuff, but he didn't really go to church. And so I was actually surprised that he sort of jumped into it. And we ended up getting, we supposedly got a prophecy that we were supposed to get married. And so that's what we did. We were being obedient to, the man of God who said he got a word from the Lord that we should be married. So that's what we did. We got married at 20. And what ended up happening again, that we were both in school an hour away from the church. And so even though we were in school, even though we had just got married, even though we worked jobs and we did all of that stuff, we commuted that hour every single Sunday, sometimes 2 or 3 days a week, to be at church. I ended up becoming ordained as, Lord, I don't know how many different titles I had. I was an evangelist, I was a prophetess, and then my husband was ordained as a deacon. So again, we were really serious about this thing, and we tithed. We were crazy. Like, we tithed on student loan refund checks. Right. Like, I'm waiting on the government to arrest me today over student loans that I tithe though. I'm exaggerating, but you know what I'm saying? Like, how do you tithe on student loans? That's crazy.
Yeah. So you're very committed to your faith and you grew up with this, and now your new husband has joined as well. What happened from there?
Like I said, again, we were just very serious. There were several years I believed that I could cast out demons. I was definitely praying in tongues. I was prophesying. We were just really into it. We were both, my husband's a musician. So we were both, I was one of the praise and worship leaders, and he's a musician. So we did that together. It was just what it was. We were just completely immersed in that for so long. So we were very serious. And actually then my sister and her husband moved to another state. So that church ended up closing. And it was always a really small storefront type church. We were moving. Every time you turn around, we were losing the building that we were in. And then we'd have church in a hotel for a little while. And, as you can imagine, it was primarily single Black women with single mothers. That's what the church was basically consisted of. And I don't know, there was always something. It was a very stressful experience, like I said, because we were constantly, like, financially, the ministry was constantly teetering on the edge of something. And those of us who were giving till it hurt, we were frustrated too, because we were like, we couldn't figure out, was it God? Was it us? Or where's the mistakes? Why are we doing everything that we believe that God is telling us to do? We're tithing, we're doing street ministry. I'm out in the summertime in the 100-degree weather, going and knocking on doors in the projects, with characters hanging around, making you feel, you know what I'm saying? Like or at night. Like, I remember one time even still being in the projects at night, and me and my partner, we were like, we got to go. That's what I was saying. But at the time, he was sort of familiar with the neighborhood, and he was like, oh, no, we're okay. And I was like, I'm ready to go. But that's the kind of stuff, we put ourselves in those kinds of situations because we believed we were doing what God was telling us to do. So we ended, like I said, so that ministry ended up closing, actually. And my husband and I ended up joining another non-denominational church, but it was I guess technically it's considered a mega church. It was like a small mega church. It was over 1,000 members, I think. And again, we were on the praise and worship team there, jumped in, we went. And as soon as we went, we immediately, it's like after the first or second time we went, we immediately went to the pastor and was like, hey, I sing, he's a musician. How can we get involved? So we were ready, we were constantly like ready to do something for the Lord, So again, that church wasn't quite as extreme as the previous one. They didn't shout as much, but they did some. They prayed in tongues a little bit, but it wasn't out of control, but it was definitely a prosperity gospel healing, faith healing type ministry, even though it wasn't to the extent of, rolling around on the floor and spitting and carrying on, which I have seen, by the way. We used to tell people that if they were praying and they started coughing, that was a demon coming out of them. So it wasn't quite that extreme. And again, my husband and I, again, we're young college students, we ended up having a baby and we're broke. We didn't have any money. So, we're losing cars. Our house was foreclosed on. We were just, I was depressed. I was suicidal. And, and just one day we both just kind of stopped and was like, what are we doing wrong? We are tithing, we're at church, we're fasting. My husband lost so much weight because he was fasting all the time because he was trying to get the answers, So that's sort of when it started to crumble for us. It wasn't so much that we were angry that things were going wrong. We were scared that we were doing something wrong. And I think that's where people don't understand the distinction. People, when I talk to people who know that, who knew the old me that was extremely religious, they say, oh, well, Candace, you went through some hard times. And, they try to tell me that it was like my experience, the type of whatever I had, I had bad experiences. And that's why I, left the church. But what I'm trying to explain is it's not that I was angry at the church or that I was upset at the ministers, or it was that I was afraid that I was doing something wrong. And that's what then led me to start studying. Now, even though I was a minister, now remember, I was a preacher. So I read the Bible plenty. I preached messages plenty. I was familiar with the word. I read the whole Bible. But it was just something that just sort of clicked for us one day that was like, what are we doing wrong? We were really, really freaking out. And it sort of started to slowly crumble because my husband really got into studying the tithing portion of things. And it sort of slowly started crumbling for him there because he saw some information here, different places that felt like the way that we had been taught about tithing is not necessarily the way that it's talked about in the Bible. So there were some things for him, with him for that. And for me, I was just like, what? I was just depressed. I remember going to that pastor of that mega church, going to him one time and saying I'm depressed. And actually, no, I take it back. I made an appointment to see the pastor's wife. And I said, oh, look, I'm depressed. I've had thoughts of death and suicide. Like, I just don't know what to do. I intentionally wanted to talk to her. I did not want to talk to pastor because the pastor was an alpha male type personality who was not very sensitive to the plight of his parishioners. So I wanted to talk to the wife. Well, what does she do? She doesn't know how to answer my question. So she gets up and goes next door and to the office next door and asks her husband to come over. Exactly what I did not want. And so he was nice. He was definitely nicer than I expected him to be, especially once I started saying, no, I'm not just depressed, y'all. I'm suicidal depressed. Then he really started softening up. But the message was still the same. You need to pray. You need to come to church. Make sure. And now it wasn't so much you need to come to church because I was there. But what I wasn't doing was going to the 8:30 Wednesday morning prayer. Now, I was there on Sundays. I was there on Wednesday Bible studies. I was there for Thursday and Saturday choir rehearsals. I was there. But his advice was that I was missing a service. So I needed to come to this other event because you're missing something. You know what I'm saying?
So your suicidal depression, the proper treatment was to pray and come to church even more than you already were, which is more than most people ever go to church.
Ever. Exactly. So I remember that the reason that I went to see her was actually because I had gotten a referral from my doctor to see a therapist. And I didn't want to go. I honestly felt that it was sinful for me to go talk to a secular therapist. And like I said, I remember I left the office and I got in the car and I cried and I made my appointment to go see my therapist. To see the therapist, because I was like, this does not answer my question. Like, even with all my religion, I knew that didn't answer my question. So I started going and like I said, then as I was going and I started taking medication, and I was mortally embarrassed that I was taking medication. Only my mother and my husband knew. And I was like, if y'all tell somebody, I'm going to kill you. That's how embarrassing, I was to be getting therapy and taking medication. So we were still really in the church for a while, even as I was getting therapy, which again, my pastor didn't know. I wasn't going to tell him. So then after another year or so was when we really started studying that deeper type of studying, where we were cross-referencing materials and we were reading stuff that we just had never read before. And yeah, so it started to crumble from there. I guess that's still the brief overview of my religious life.
So how did that tie in then with your own becoming a therapist? Did the therapy that you were attending help? And it sounds like your faith, yours and your husband's, were on the same crumbling trajectory. How did that all come together? Tell us about your professional career and where that took off.
Oh, yeah. Me going to therapy, actually, my therapist himself suggested that I go to school for counseling. And he went to Wake Forest University, and we were in Greensboro, so we were about 30 minutes away. And so, this is something that many, depending on who you talk to, they say it crossed some boundaries. But, he said, look, let me take you over here to the school and, I can introduce you to the professors and show you around. And, he was really serious, like really encouraging me to go to school, to go back for this master's in counseling. So he did. I met him one day out, it wasn't a therapy session. It was just meet me here. And he took me to the school and showed me the school and the professors, and I applied. So he was my therapist. Was the reason that I applied to a master's program. And by the time I started school was when the crumbling had already started to happen. So, I started school September. That summer was all the crumbling was happening. So even when I went back to, going to school, I was still very religious. And I remember, I'm still friends with everybody now. And they laugh sometimes because they were like, day one, I walked in the door talking about God and Jesus and my faith. And, you do the get to know each other, go around the circle. And I was God and faith and Jesus, everything about me. So even at the beginning of the master's, I was still very much committed to at least my religious beliefs. I wasn't going to church quite as regularly, but I was still committed to the belief, All of my life, or I would say my adult life, I remember I used to say, I'm going to write a book and I'm going to call it Jesus is All You Need and Other Lies the Church Tells. Now, that was me as a minister. And because I felt like even back then, as committed as I was, I always felt like there was a piece of something that was missing. There was a piece of something that we were not giving our parishioners. And that to me was always the sort of the mental health support part of things, more of the mental health, and then actually, just sort of practical things. Everything was always spiritually minded and spiritually oriented, that I felt like there was plenty of real world here in my everyday life stuff that was not being addressed.
Yeah, and it sounds like that understanding and that transformation and how you looked at the world is part of what led you to write the book we're talking about today, the Ebony Exodus Project.
Exactly. Because in the master's program, you get assignments to write papers. And I know in the very beginning, one of my earliest assignments was I did some research, or sort of like a meta-analysis of the research, about, and my topic was depression. I don't know if it was specifically Black people in depression, or it was just depression and, and faith, sort of looking at how does faith mediate depression, or how much it does or not, does not. It was a lit review, basically. So I read all these books and research, articles. And so I had to sort of synthesize it. So after that, I was so interested in that one topic that as I went through the rest of the program, every time I got an assignment, I somehow connected it back to that theme, that topic. So I guess, even back then, I didn't think about writing a book that way. Like I said, from years prior, I had this idea of a book. I'd always had this sort of thing in my mind, but it was definitely not depression and Jesus or depression and God. And so, and of course, and still, even in the beginning at my master's program, I was of the mindset still that religion could alleviate depression symptoms. So, I'm doing my research and going along, and definitely being in that program and having the time to really think about it and reading more and more research about depression and religion, and realizing that almost everything you read says, yes, spirituality is essential to alleviating depression. Everybody says that. There's a gajillion pieces of research that says that. And so even though that's what I believed, I still needed to find research that takes the opposite stance, and I couldn't. And it was like, there's got to be some research out here somewhere. And, there wasn't really much. And, so all of these things happening to me in the master's program, really started challenging me. Even things like diversity class and, dealing with homosexuality and mental health, and how, again, in the beginning, I was just black and white. Oh, homosexuality is wrong. Nothing else to talk about here, And so, of course, being in that sort of program, I couldn't say that. I couldn't do that. That you're not allowed to just say, nope, I'm closed-minded to that topic, And so I found that, which is what's supposed to happen. I started becoming more sensitive to other issues, and, really sort of my black and white way of viewing the world really started to, fall apart as I'm in this program.
So tell us a little bit about the book itself. You got the subtitle, Why Some Black Women Are Walking Out on Religion, and Others Should Too. I'm taking it that's a central theme of the book.
Yeah, so my thesis, my mantra that I tell everybody that I say all the time is this: Black women are the single most religious demographic in the United States, yet we are the bottom of the totem pole in practically every measure of quality of life. When you think of mental health, physical health, emotion, financially, all of that. So the idea of the book, what it all centers around is that the Black church and, religion in general, but especially true in the Black church, tells us that, again, Jesus is all you need. If you pay your tithes, you'll be wealthy. If you fast and pray, you'll be healthy. If you're submissive and obedient, you'll have a happy marriage. Those are the primary tenets. Yet, we're not happy. We're not wealthy. We're not healthy. So my point is that if the church wants to take credit for the good stuff, then they're going to have to step up and take some of the blame for the bad stuff. You don't get to claim all of the credit for, the civil rights movement, for example, but then don't want to talk about the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s and don't want to take any of the blame for, why didn't Jesus heal all these crack addicts in the 80s? You know what I'm saying? Just sort of looking at it like that and just sort of highlighting the fact that the Bible and the church is telling you that you should be healthy and happy and you're paying all your tithes, but you're not. Why is that?
Yeah. So Candace, tell us in your experience, why do we have this situation of a very religious demographic of African-American women supporting the church, but nonetheless having very little power with that institution, and it's not helping them? Why do we have that? What are some things that contribute to it, do you think?
Obviously you can't talk about anything Black American without referencing slavery, so obviously I think that plays a part in it, being that if you're in this situation where you're being abused and you're being, told that this is what you have to, you know what I'm saying? Being in slavery and all the negatives that go with that. And then you're hearing this story about Moses, and Moses led the captives out of slavery. And, you're hearing these stories. And if you think about the Africans coming over were already spiritual in nature, many of them were probably polytheistic. And so in my mind, at least this is, the way I'm thinking about it, is that it's not a stretch. It wouldn't have been a stretch for them to want to worship a different type of God. And, a lot of people say, I don't understand how they could worship, this God and he espouses slavery or supports slavery or allows slavery. But of course, if you're thinking about the slaves themselves, they probably weren't being taught those messages as stringently. I don't know. Well, I don't know. I take it back. They probably were, because they were probably being told that that's your lot in life, and this is what the Bible says, and it's okay. But I'm not sure why they would have been attracted to that. But I think it's sort of like, I guess I'm sort of thinking maybe about the Stockholm syndrome sort of thing. You start to identify with your captors.
Yeah, I suspect a part of it may be that the situation that they would have been in being a horrible one, the promise of, after you die, everything is awesome. So just keep right on doing what you're doing and great things will happen to you sometime later. But for right now.
Exactly. I think that the Moses story, and being captive in Egypt and being led out into the promised land, I think that story itself probably was very, it's an enticing story. It's an exciting story. It would be anybody in slavery would be excited about that sort of story, to be told, see, this is the God that you're worshiping. He did this for these people. Now he's going to do it for you. He could do it for you, too. Or at least that's what they're believing. I'm sure the slave owners weren't telling them that, but that's what they were telling themselves, I suppose.
So, Candace, some of your themes in the book are about leaving the church, at the very least the institution, and perhaps the faith itself. What are some things that might help change this situation? Is it possible to change the church from within, or do you think the only real choice is for Black women to leave? What are some things that can change this?
Well, I think it goes along with what what we were just talking about. Well, how did they get there in the first place? And I think even getting outside of, racism and all of that, sort of the Black culture, is very centered around family. It's very group oriented. It's very, you're not supposed to think about self. You think about your family. The whole takes a village to raise a child, and, all of that. I think most research and most people would agree, that Black American culture is very family and group oriented. And so, when your family and your group has been cemented for, 100 years or 200 years or however many years it's all been evolving around, is religion. Your great grandmama, their family was revolved around religion, and it just sort of keeps going. And I think, so answering the older question, your previous question, which is how did this happen in the first place? I think, that it just became so enmeshed. Religion became so enmeshed with family and, being part of the group and supporting the group and all of us pulling together. I think that's sort of a natural outgrowth of, African tribalism and that sort of thing. And then also dealing with slavery and racism and stuff, you pull together as a group. And then the cement in all of that was religion. So then your next question is, how do you get out of it? You got to bring a jackhammer to some, you talk about a big block of concrete and cement. I think that it's just going to have to all be broken up completely. I think that religion is harmful. I think especially the Black church in America. I feel like the negatives outweigh any potential benefits. And even the benefits themselves, my question is always, but you can have those same benefits without being a church member, right? You
can still practice compassion and kindness without a religious institution to brand it.
Exactly. So I think I think Black women and Black men and everybody, whole American culture, I think that in general, the mindset that you can't have, there's no goodness without God. I think that as people start to see that there are good people out there in the world who, don't believe in God, obviously that's one thing. And one of the things that I actually talk about at the very back of the book, and one of the things that I really, really, really believe wholeheartedly in, which is what you were saying at the beginning before we started recording, which is science. I feel like science education is going to be one of the key factors towards like a mass outpouring, at least in my opinion, because again, like I said, when my friends look at me and my friends and my family, they look at the emotional trauma that I went through. They look at my depression, my anxiety. They look at my financial ruin. They look at all these negative things in my life and they say, see, that's why. But they don't understand that might have kickstarted it, but there's evolution. There's all this other stuff out there in the world. There's the archaeological evidence that there was not a flood, 5,000 years ago. And I think that sort of stuff, when you can actually, I feel like attacking the truth of the far-fetched claims, to me, is more meaningful than anything. That's what solidifies it for me, and I've, over the years, I've had my moments of times where I felt like, suddenly became afraid that, what if I'm gonna go to hell? Gosh, what if I'm completely wrong and I end up in hell? But then, like I said, I'm able to go back to something concrete like science. And so I think that I really, really would like to see the Black community put more emphasis on science education. And a lot of Black atheist movement folk, will say, Black people, we're more concerned with issues of social justice and social change and all that, in which that does tend to be true. That is what you see more of when you're talking to Black atheists. But I would like to see it extend further than that, because I think that the science education, that concrete stuff that you can touch and see and feel, that's how you oppose the metaphysical stuff that you can't see, that you can't touch, that you can't feel, being the spiritual stuff, and the harmful metaphysical stuff. Let me say that, because of course I do believe in things like meditation and that sort of thing. But you know what I'm saying?
Still based in science. Yeah, I'm with you. And I think that this situation is going to change a great deal. In particular, I'm looking forward to seeing how Black participation in science programs increases after the new series Cosmos comes out. They're redoing Carl Sagan's with Neil deGrasse Tyson running it. And he's a phenomenal speaker. He's brilliant. And what a wonderful banner and model for African American children in our society, that look, here's science, and this is a Black man doing it and leading it and doing it beautifully. Those are the kinds of icons I just love seeing that more and more.
And Neil deGrasse Tyson's not stuffy or, pretentious or anything. Like, maybe he'll hear this podcast. Somebody please share this with Neil deGrasse Tyson, because I just told my husband maybe 2 nights ago, I want Neil deGrasse Tyson to be my father. Like, I said, I love my daddy. I have no daddy issues. But Neil deGrasse Tyson is just so awesome. Like, maybe he'll adopt me. I'm about to be 33. Please adopt me. I don't care. It's never too late.
If you happen to have an in to Neil deGrasse Tyson, of course, we'd be delighted to have him on The Secular Buddhist. That would be terrific. So let's take a segue to something else that you're involved with. In addition to the Ebony Exodus project and the website that you have for that, ebonyexodus.com, you're also involved with the Secular Therapist project. Tell us a little bit about that for a few minutes.
Well, the Secular Therapist Project, actually, you don't have to be a secularist or an atheist or anything. All you have to do is you have to promise that you will provide completely secular therapy, meaning, you're not going to bust out a Bible scripture. You're not going to encourage the person to pray. You're not going to go there. Of course, if a client wants to go there, then you go there, but you're not going to take things there. And the Secular Therapist Project was born out of Daryl Ray, because he's an atheist researcher and he wrote the Sex and God books, and he's also a psychologist. And so he, realized that there was a need for mental health professionals that are not going to immediately go straight to religion, because that's one of the big complaints that you find with a lot of ex-religious people, that they want therapy. Maybe they need therapy. They recognize that, but every time they go see somebody, it ends up being religious in nature, or they feel, or even if the person doesn't bring anything spiritual to the conversation, some of the complaints have been that the people are really uncomfortable dealing with atheism, or, are really, I've actually had one client of mine tell me that she felt like she had a not felt like she did have a previous therapist who told her that she couldn't work with her because she was an atheist. The therapist told the client that she couldn't work with her because she was an atheist, and that and was really hostile towards her once the client came out as being an atheist to the therapist. And so apparently that happens a lot, which I'm, as a licensed professional, I'm really embarrassed to think that there could be mental health professionals out there who take a very judgmental attitude like that. And so that was sort of the purpose of the Secular Therapist Project, is that people can go here and know that they're not going to have to worry about that sort of judgment.
Yeah, and that is a problem, I'll say, from my own experience. One time getting therapy during a down period in my life a number of years ago, started seeing a therapist, and she said, "Oh, you have to read this book," and started reading a book, and the answer to my depression was Jesus. I had been very clear with her up front. I'm an atheist. Don't ever give me a book like this again. She said, "Oh, I have a different one. I'm so sorry. Try this one." And it starts with our experience in the moment. So these are, of course, very familiar to me as a meditator, and there's a lot of good stuff there. And then you get to the last couple chapters, and the answer to your depression is Jesus again. And I said, "I'm sorry, we're done. You're here to proselytize your religious views. You're not here to give therapy." And that happens, and it's unfortunate. So I'm very glad that this has been set up, because people need the opportunity to be able to share their psychological problems and get help for them without having to be coerced into a religious ideological point of view.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and this is, people talk about white privilege. I think this is an area where, any atheist or any ex-believer could probably recognize the privilege here, the Christian privilege. And so I sort of point that out to non-blacks to say, here's an example of what privilege looks like, in case you're having a hard time understanding what privilege is.
Get it. I know you can't see it because you're in the middle of it. I do understand that, because we all have goggles on. I get that. But we can come up with scenarios where you can understand.
Right. I used to do a lot of supervision of bachelor's level therapists, or, they weren't licensed professionals, but other mental health professionals. I used to do a lot of supervision. And I can't tell you how many times it would come up that I would have to go, "You can't say that. That's your religious belief. You can't say that to a client." Or, "No, you can't offer to start a session with prayer." Like, if they want to start a session with prayer, maybe. But what the sad thing is, a lot of those people that I was having to constantly remind were people who got their master's degrees online from Liberty University, or even just, I remember one time I actually sort of fussed at somebody in a supervision session in front of a bunch of people, because she said she was afraid to work with a client because that client apparently had demons. I was like, first of all, demonic possession is not a mental health diagnosis. You can't say you don't want to work with this 9-year-old girl because you think she's got demons because she hears voices, So
yeah, what else might it be?
Exactly.
If we put demons out of the equation, you as a mental health professional, what other mental illnesses might fit into that? Well, Candace, thanks so much for talking with me today. I wanted to mention that in early June of 2014, for listeners who are hearing this prior to that, the current plan is for me to join Candace in person, along with Daniel Strain, Greta Christina, and our friend Rick Heller, for a panel on mindfulness that Rick has proposed for the American Humanist Association 2014 conference in Philadelphia. So I hope all that works out, and I get to see you there, Candace. It would be great to be sitting at the same table with you.
I know. I'm excited. Can't wait.
So our guest today has been Candace Gorham, and I've been speaking about the Ebony Exodus Project. You can find out more about Candace's work on the website ebonyexodus.com. Candace, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are also linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.